Blog Talk Radio.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio. QLPOR, as it's widely known, features a bevy of poets, spoken word artists, and live poetry readings with best-selling authors. Your host is Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Hello, everyone. This evening, for your quintessential listening poetry pleasure, I'm very pleased to welcome internationally acclaimed and award-winning poet Indran Amirthanayagam to the program. Indran is a master poet, and his newest book, Origami, Selected Poems of Manuel, Ulacia, will be published by early 2023. Indran, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Ingram. Michael, thank you. I love this show. I love the opportunity it gives to read, to think out loud about the art of poetry, and to engage in conversation with you is a special thing. Thank you.
Oh, hey, this is always a treat for me because you're constantly surprising me, and I love it. I love it. Let's begin this journey. All right. Tell me about your new book. I want to hear everything. What inspired you?
Oh, I'm so excited. It's such a joy to have this book. It began more than 20 years ago in 1999 when I first got to Mexico City. My friend Jaime Manrique gave me a name of someone to look up, Manuel Ulacia, and the names of a few other poets and writers. And Manuel, the American embassy where I was working in Mexico City, and he took me out to a wonderful lunch, a green mole sauce in the Zona Rosa near the embassy. And from there, the friendship began, and it kicked off, and I started writing poetry in Spanish, and Manuel corrected my poems, and then I started translating his poems into English. Now, Manuel had studied a PhD in Spanish literature at Yale. He was fluent in English, but not in poetic English as such. And so, the conversation helped him, and it helped me. I learned my Spanish, and I learned his poetry, translating it. And what a poet! What a poet! He became my closest friend of those years in Mexico City. And then when I published my first book in Spanish, El Infierno de los Pájaros, he wrote a blurb for the back of the book, and then we had finished these translations, and he told me, maybe we have 1 more hour to go over them. And the last night I was in Mexico City, he invited us over to his home for dinner, and there were literally a dozen people around the table. It was a fantastic farewell meal, sad but full of joy as well for the friendships that had begun in Mexico. And the joy of looking forward to the book. I mean, these poems were going to come out that year in 2001. But, 2 months later, that was in June, and in August, I got home. I was at home in Washington, in Rockville, and I got this terrible, terrible news that Manuel had passed. He had been swimming off the coast of Zihuatanejo in Mexico, and a riptide pulled him away. And it was on Sunday afternoon around 5 p.m., which has a sort of symbolic weight that time. I can comment on that later. And it was just devastating news, devastating. And, and one of the consequences was that book was never published. It was not published then. The publisher abandoned the project. And then years went by, and I published some of the poems in an anthology in India, and I was very pleased for that. But Manuel's poetry just sort of went, it was in the drawer. I would send it out occasionally to try and get it published here and there. Then 20 years later, I get to know Diálogos books in New Orleans, and Bill Lavender. And Bill and Diálogos published my book, Ventana Azul, translated as Blue Window, by Jennifer Rathbun into English. And then I offered him this book, and he accepted it. he has produced the most beautiful book. And Manuel's sister, Isabel Ulacia, a photographer, provided the cover art, which is just outstanding. It's of origami, an image of origami that she had made many years ago, just around after Manuel's passing. So it was a bittersweet, that memory. And then she had the photograph of it, and that is the cover. And on the back is a photograph of Manuel, a young Manuel. We used to know him as Manolo, Manuel short, Manolo familiar. And anyway, so the book has had a long history. It was 22 years in the waiting room before it came in for the appointment with immortality. I hope it is immortality, because these are immortal poems. These are immortal poems. I hope you'll get a sense of the joy and the beauty of them, and the delicacy of them, and the fragility and the sort of and the melancholy of them as well, as you hear some tonight.
Well, it sounds like, just listening to you, that he was truly your brother in poetry. So what I'd like to know, what were some of the predominant things that he wrote about? What did he write about in his work?
Well, Manuel was gay. He was a gay poet at a time when in Mexico and elsewhere you were sort of quiet about your orientation. You didn't make much of a big deal of it. I mean, he was living freely and practicing his homosexuality, but it was something that his coming out took a while. He went out with women early on in his life as a young man. And eventually he declared in his gay self, and then wrote poems that are. I mean, if you have read Kavyafi's poems, for example, or this is a Mexican Kavafi, writing. It's really so frank and so beautiful that they're love poems. They are eternal in that sense. I mean, they speak to any lover anywhere, anytime. He wrote them in Spanish. Now they're available in English here in this translation. And it's a sad thing when I think of Manuel, what was lost when that riptide took him away. But then I think of what he left behind and what we have in our hands, these poems, and they cross ages and cultures and boundaries. And so I'm just grateful to have had the chance to have known him and to have worked on these poems and brought them into English. This was my first translation. I've become a translator of many other poets since, but this book is a very special book for that reason. The first book is always a very special book, and this was the first encounter. With the other.
Tonight is a celebration of his life and his gift, his creative gift.
That's right.
Now,
that's right.
What I'd like to know, the title, Origami. Tell me about the title. Where does that come from?
Well, if you think of origami, these miniature worlds, right? These miniature universes, these small trees, small bushes, small streams, small rocks, all delicately made of with paper. So the fragility of paper, and yet the representation of the world as it is, but in this light, almost disposable form, And I think it's something about that beauty that beauty doesn't stay still. It moves, and it changes form. And so origami captures that beauty in the instant, in the instant. But that is an instant, and it can move and disappear. There is nothing more true in the world than the reality of that we are simply moving creatures. Our blood moves inside of us. We ourselves move. We move from different stages in life as we grow up from infancy through adolescence, through adulthood. And then we move to another stage when we pass this mortal coil and we move into into another world, a supernatural world, a heaven, a hell. I don't know where exactly we go, but we go beyond. And we're constantly travelers. We're travelers, constant travelers. And Origami, I think, captures the fragility of that. And he has a beautiful poem, a long poem, called Origami para un día de lluvia, Origami for a rainy day. And you can think of the rain falling outside, clattering the windows, and a boy inside working, reading, writing his small poems and making his small world of origami. And that's a beautiful poem. It's a very long poem, and it's one of the great poems in the Spanish language, and it's in this book, and it's also honored that he had the chance to translate it.
All right. How did you structure the contents of the book? These are sections, chapters. Tell me about the content. How's it structured?
It's structured by the different books that Manuel published in his life. So I take poems from each of those books. So it begins with El Río y la Piedra, The River and the Stone, which he published, which are poems from 1981 to 89. And then Origami for a Rainy Day, which was the long poem. And then Arabian Nights and Scottish Mornings, which was unpublished when he died, but later was included in a posthumous book published in Spanish by Fondo de Cultura Económica. And then it goes on from there to El Plato Azul, another long poem, another magnificent poem of Manuel's, which was published just in 1999, 2000. And then I added the first poems. He wanted these to be first in the book, but I put them last because they're beautiful poems. They're slighter poems. And I think they work well for someone who has read the major poems and would like to read everything of Manuel, so he can go or she can go to the last section of the book and read from the first poems. There's tiny little lyric imagist poems at the end. I mean, just to give you an idea of how small, and you can imagine these 3-line poems. Like, for example, I'll just read you one of those first poems just to give an idea. On the beach, words of salt and spray catch themselves. The sea's waves name the earth. And here's another one, the millennial tortoise. In the garden, the millennial tortoise eats the word grass. So that's where the book ends. But those are the first poems. Yeah.
Right. Well, please share with me the titles of at least 4 of the poems. The titles.
Will do. I mean, for example, just the titles. I'll give you a sense. From the first part of the book, El Río y la Piedra. I'll give you the Spanish first. Regreso a la ciudad, return to the city. Encuentros, encounter. Tenochtitlan blues. En un baño de vapor, in the steam bath. Unidad, unit. Mar Egeo, Aegean Sea. Semilla, seed. Rio, river. Visita al Turk's Head pub, visit the Turk's Head pub, and so on and so forth. Then it goes on. There are many poems in the book. It's a big, thick book, about 250 pages. And they also have, it also includes 2 poems I wrote, tribute poems I wrote to Manuel at different stages. Both one to begin the book and one at the end, which I wrote just before it went to press. And also it has an introduction by Alfred Korn, who knew Manuel and writes his memories of Manuel at the beginning of the book. So it's and one more thing I want to mention: Suzanne Jill Levine, who's really a legendary translator. She translated Manuel Puig, for example. She contributed her translation of Manuel's poem Rio, River, to the book, and so I'm very grateful to Suzanne Jill Levine for that. And so it's a testimony. It's a testimonial. It's a collection of memories. This book, it includes tribute poems, and it's Manuel, gloriously Manuel throughout. So I'm very grateful to Diálogos Books for making this possible. Yeah.
Wow. What I'd like to know in terms of the titles, tell me about that process of generating those titles. Was it difficult based on what you know of him? Tell me about the titles.
Well, no, I mean, these were titles that Manuel gave to the poem, so I just made them into English. Yeah. There was no need to title poems that weren't titled now. The only thing that I did differently from the original composition was move the first poems to the end rather than keep them at the beginning of the book. Yeah.
I see. Well, before we move into you sharing from the book, Indran, tell me, what did you learn about yourself from writing this book? Who are you as a consequence of writing this book?
Well, I'm a translator. You know, I become a translator thanks to this book and then to the books and the poets I've translated since then. I myself am a translated man, a poet who was born in another country called Ceylon that no longer exists. Now it's known as Sri Lanka, where I spoke Tamil and Sinhalese as well as English. And I've forgotten Tamil and I forgot the Sinhalese. So I'm a Tamil from an island who no longer speaks Tamil. But I speak English, which of course was also and is one of the languages of the island. And I now speak Spanish and French and Portuguese and Haitian Creole, thanks to the poets of these countries where I've learned these languages, thanks to the diplomatic career I've held over the last 29 years. And I'm about to retire from that career, but I'm going to go sailing strong as a poet, a translator, a publisher, with Sarah Cahill-Maron. We publish Beltway Editions, books of poetry, and excited about that venture. So there's lots to do and always little time. But that'll be make the time.
That's true. If you had to advise your readers prior to reading this particular book, what would you tell them? It's out in the bookstore.
I would say there is a transparency to these lines, a luminosity to these lines that is worth all its light, in gold and in time. So spend time with these poems. Spend time with this light. It's almost like when you look at a certain painter. For example, when you see Edward Hopper's A Woman in the Sun, for example, the light coming in through the window at the woman as she stands staring at the window out. That light, he captures that light in words and in phrases. And these are, it's a kind of visual song that he presents for us. And I love song. I'm a poet of song, of lyric. And I love poets who write lyrics. And Manuel is a lyricist. He's also a painter with words. And that, to me, is almost, that's epiphany, right? You have the visual song, you have the oral song, and you have light being played with by a master craftsman of light, this poet. And I'm a very conservative translator. I wanted to capture that music in English without muddying it up or messing it up or putting myself into it. I wanted to be really a vessel for his voice that find the appropriate English words. Now, this was when I was translating these poems. This was before internet, and there was internet, but not in the same way as we have today. And it was before I was using dictionaries. I was using hard copy dictionaries, the Real Academia, the Espanol, the RAI. I was using other dictionaries, Larousse, various dictionaries. And I had the luck that Manuel was an English speaker, so we could discuss, phrases together over coffee, over a meal, and so on. And so it was a collaborative process as well. So I feel very close to this book because I had the luck of translating it with a living author, Manuel in that case at that time.
Well, without further ado, my friend, please share from your book.
I will, and I'll read from the first part, El Río y la Piedra, the river and the stone, and encuentros. Entregarte como la piedra al vértigo profundo de la noche, caer y volver a estar donde estuvimos, ser los mismos y ser otros, como si todo otra vez fuera nuevo. El tren que pasa, la ventana azul, mi cuerpo desnudo junto al tuyo, llenos de amor en un cuarto vacío. Encounter. Give yourself like a stone to the deep vertigo of night, all and return to be where we once were. Be the same and yet be others, as if everything were new again. The passing train, the blue window, my body naked against yours, filled with love in an empty room. Tenochtitlan Blues. Cae la tarde y termina tu viaje. Mañana cuando te marches te buscaré en el vacío que dejaste por todas partes. Y si el día es claro, tal vez alcance a ver los volcanes siempre cubiertos de nieve, como el silencio que envuelve a dos cuerpos que se miraron sin tocarse siquiera. Tenochtitlan Blues. Evening falls and you finish your trip. Tomorrow when you go, I will look for you in the emptiness you left everywhere. And if the day is clear, perhaps I may get to see the two volcanoes forever covered with snow, like the silence that envelopes two bodies that gazed at each other without even touching. Hampstead Heath. This I will read just the English. Manuel was a ceaseless traveler, and in this case in London, Hampstead Heath. Perhaps all that's lacking is a change of light on the water's surface, a glance that meets another glance to leave behind, without knowing it, a sure world. You were on the bank of the pond watching the small sailing ships when he invited you to go deep into the wood, and without saying a word, iron after the call of the magnet, you followed him in. How much sun spilled among the green branches, how much pleasure while your legs trembled with fear. Today you remember neither his name nor face. Perhaps the only trace left imprinted by time is that smell of tobacco and eau de cologne, which for 15 years has stayed with you through all the cities and is now in none. And I will read now just a few passages from the long poem Origami for a Rainy Day, just to give you an idea of how it begins. Origami for a rainy day. This rain that beats the windows is the same as yesterday's. You hear the incessant drops falling like a drumming that imitates the passing of the day in flight. The transparent pool in the garden, a tremulous reflection, return you to the place where water no longer wets you, to the empty house eaten by time, saved by memory. Engrossed before the window, you see it rain. By the scant light of the lamp, the white rain contrasts with the dark air. Michael?
Wow. I always enjoy hearing you read Spanish, English, French, Haitian Creole, whatever. You're just an amazing artist, amazing poet, amazing man. What I'd like to know, this is a relatively general question, can poetry transcend ideologies? What do you think about that, Indran? Different ideologies.
Can poetry transcend ideologies? It's a very important question because, the word ideology is based in the idea, right? And, poetry, is written with a lot of emotion and with a lot of feeling. And, was it Shelley who said poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility? But it's the base, that emotion, that feeling is mixed up with the idea. There is an idea in every poem. And, and there's a message, you could say, in every poem. A poem is not just the rush of an emotion, a crying onto the page, or seething anger, encapsulated in a verse. it's an idea about the world, about order, about human society, about animal society, about ecology, about politics. Politics means polis, the community, the affairs of the community. So it's not, I write poetry often in response to what's happening around me in the news and what I read, what I hear about, what's happening in the country. My recent book is called 10,000 Steps Against the Tyrant, that orange-haired tyrant we had this president here for a while.
Yes.
And the campaign against that ideology, that hatred. So I don't dismiss poetry as, I think poetry can serve us, and there are no subjects that are foreign to poetry or that are obstacles for poetry. But that said, for me, a poem is a kind of verbal music, a linguistic song. And so it pleases the ear as well as, and it's also a painting. So there are various kinds of pleasure: the oral pleasure, the visual pleasure, and the intellectual pleasure. The idea, as it's when Eliot writes, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table." That you can see that evening spread out against the sky. And then you have this very arresting, unusual image, a patient etherized upon a table, an unsettling, unpleasant image. But that's the modern world. It's the beauty, it's the ugliness and the beauty. It's the shock and as well. So you confront reality, and so I at the same time, I'm not a fan of jargon in poetry. Repetitions that of words and phrases that have lost their meaning. If you read Orwell's essay "Politics in the English Language," you see how words become cliches and they lose all sense of their original meaning or impulse. And so poets have a job to play in rescuing words and giving them life and meaning again. Even the hardest words, something like "dead as a doornail," well, take that on as a challenge and make that, a fresh phrase. That's part. Sorry, go ahead.
No, continue. I'll ask later. Go ahead. No, please continue.
No, I was just thinking that I'm sorry.
All right. Well, okay. I guess, like I said, again, you are both so enthused about this art and craft of poetry. We both have things we'd like to say. But Indran, some people believe that poetry is dying. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Yes.
I don't know. If you go to the wake of poetry, you're going to meet a lot of people eating and fellowship, and then new poems will be written.
I like that.
Poetry will be written even at the funeral. In fact, at the funeral, it is the only art that really works to be recited out loud. I remember, in my own life, my father, when he died, I was in Mexico at the time, and he had just seen him, the First Holy Communion of my son, and then he had gone back home to Rockville with this house where I'm speaking from now, and he had gone to church, and he was waiting for communion, and he had a heart attack, and he couldn't be revived. Now, I went back from Mexico, and on the plane I started writing about my father, which became in prose an obituary. But then I started writing poems, and one of the poems I read at the funeral a few days later. So, poetry brings people together. It's consoling. At the very least, it's helpful at such moments. So I can't imagine poetry dying. I can't imagine life without poetry, because even the most bleakest landscape, there are parts of Iceland that have been denuded by centuries of exploitation, but now there are there's a row of little flowers, little growing on this desert hill, you see. I mean, the idea of restitution, of rescuing, of recreating, of second growth forest. I mean, I'm an optimist, not a pessimist. And I think we can rescue. And poetry has a role to play in that rescue act, both as a human society and as a planet. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, as I was preparing for this program tonight, I read that statement that it stated that many people believe poetry is dying. I knew that was wrong. I knew it was wrong. There's no way that could be true. No way. No way.
Yeah. I mean, Auden used to say poetry makes nothing happen. It exists in the valley of its saying, a way of happening, a mouth. I mean, it's a great line in a poem, but it doesn't. I didn't believe it. I've always railed against that. I think it's exactly the opposite. It makes something happen. It gives me hope. I mean, that word hope is very powerful. And poetry enables that hope in me as a writer, in the poet, when I read a poem. So ultimately, it's a releaser of endorphins. It's a serotonin going to the brain. It's walking, literally, the mind. As you walk your body, you get fitter. You walk your mind reading the poem or writing the poem. So reading is as important as writing. Reading the writing inspires the writing. Writing inspires the reading. It's a cycle. And
all right. Well, please, you're incredible. Please share some more from the book. We can talk on.
Thank you.
So, please share some more.
Let me see. I'll read a few from a section called Arabian Night and Knight and Scottish Mornings. At the time, and I was translating his poems, they were unpublished. They were just in his manuscript. The first one is called La Cena. I'll read the Spanish in one or two cases, and then otherwise just the English. But just to give you an idea of the Spanish, this one's called La Cena, or Supper. Incendiados los azules en constante movimiento chocan, pactan y se licuan. Todavía un sol naranja ilumina la terraza. El albero del camino, las copas de los cipreses, la ciudad en la hondonada, blanca marea de luces que crece mientras la noche hace más espeso el bosque. Alrededor de la mesa los amigos cenan, hablan, asisten a doble fiesta, la que ocurre allá en la bóveda, celeste coreografía en la que el día se fuga y la que el diálogo crea. Entre el silencio de dos palabras un grillo canta, emanación de una estrella que a lo lejos centellea. Otra luz brilla en los ojos de los que oyen y contemplan. Eco del eco del eco. La estrella, el canto y la llama. Describe solo el poema. Supper. The blues on fire, moving constantly, crash, agree, and liquefy. An orange sun still lights the terrace, the clay of the road, the cypress cups, the city below in a hollow valley, tide of lights that grows while the night thickens the wood. Around the table, friends eat and talk, attend a double feast, one that occurs up there in the firmament, celestial choreography in which the day flees and which dialogue creates. In the silence between two words, the cricket sings, the emanation of a star, sparkles far away. Another light shines in the eyes of those who hear and contemplate, echo of the echo of an echo, star, song, and flame. Only the poem writes itself. There are ideas, you see, in this poem, and he manifests them through these images of looking out at the night sky. Arabian Night, just read the English here. Mountains, olive trees, vegetable fields in the valley, the high ochre walls of the royal palace in the old city, the night breeze, the muezzin's voice far away, monotonous, the usual cafe and its parishioners. Sitting on the terrace of the garden of El Habul in Meknes, a dark youth wearing a white jalaba, after a long while, after drinking the mint tea he had ordered, approached you to learn from where you came. And while he told you the history of that place, he peeled a ripe fig. With a knife he drew suddenly. The reflection of the street lamp on the blade touched your face. 3 drops of milk spilled on his fingers. When he noticed your gaze, his pupils dilated like a tiger's. Then he divided the fig, a flowering filled with seeds that seemed to burn in the vault of the night. And immediately he put one half in your mouth and the other with an agile flick in his own. What pleasure in tasting the fruit! What vertigo on the edge of the hour! Blood thickened, the senses opened up to another time. Suddenly you felt his slipper touch your foot, and without a word you went with him through the streets of the old city. Now, in the Ritz at Meknes, one glance was enough. The silence between 2 sentences, the tenuous graze of your hand when you asked for the key in the heat of the siesta, so that the young concierge, with a glance like a gazelle's, went behind you to your room, his olive-toned muscles, with their fragrance of orange blossoms, and to kiss his ample lips, flavored with cardamom, as the fans spun round, refreshing the intertwined bodies, desiring each other in their delirium, the way the desert desires water. What pleasure in the instant when bodies forget reality and let it go. Where? The city woke up in the fullness of the hour. Cars, motorcycles, the radio's music, mysterious Arabic brought you back to the world. The concierge said goodbye in a hurry and left the room. You fell asleep and woke in another dream when the muezzin began to pray into his microphone. From the balcony, the palace shone resplendent in the sonorous night, full of stars. Echo?
Yes. Adolfo Castello, in his article, Manuel, Ulacia, Something Very Luminous Lost, made the following statement. He said, in terms of Manuel's work, even the riskiest moments of the merging of the poetic and amorous communion, Manuel Ulacia is capable of being both measured and extreme. What do you think of that? Is that true, based on what your knowledge of him?
Measured and extreme. I think,
yes.
Who wrote that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name.
Adolfo Castello. And
Adolfo Castello. Yes.
Yes.
I know him. He's a Mexican critic and writer. Yes, good observation. Measured and extreme. Measured in the sense that he measures his verses, They're free verse, but with a lot of attention to rhyme and off rhymes and the musical elements, of the prosody. At the same time, he's writing about wild experiences, and he's writing freely about them, but in measured verse. Yes. I mean, just as the poem I just read about the affair, with the concierge, the way he put it. But he seems to write about it in a way that, to me, is universal and sort of classical, like sculptured in stone. Like yes. When Michelangelo does his David or something. That there's a beauty, a kind of classical beauty to the encounter, the way he describes it, Manuel does. That
yes,
removes any kind of morality or any sort of questioning, or one just simply appreciates the the elegance of the expression and the beauty of the scene, the opening. I don't know. That's why when I think of Manuel's poetry, I do think I go back to the Greeks, and I go back to who were quite famous for their loving among among themselves, and I go back to Cavafy, who if any of the listeners have not read, I recommend Cavafy very strongly to everyone, who was a sort of a father figure for erotic poetry. And Cavafy he was a Greek poet who lived in Alexandria at the turn of the beginning of the 1900s, early part of the 20th century. So, and then you think of Auden, and there's a long tradition of gay poetry going way back, and Manuel. I don't want to classify him as this kind of poet or that. I would call him. Yes. So I would say that he's a gay poet, but he's a universal poet in a sense. He writes about love. I mean, one can. It's not. It's not a limited love he's writing about. He's writing about an experience that all of us share, whatever our orientation, wherever our wishes. We can all appreciate that embrace of the other, that embrace the muezzin's call, the mysterious call in that Arabian context, and the desire for eliminating that essential solitude one feels at times, and finding it through communion with another. And Manuel is a great poet of love. He's also, I think, in an interesting way, you asked earlier about ideology. I wonder if one reads Manuel, I wouldn't call him, a political poet in the sense that one would use that term to describe perhaps Allen Ginsberg's poetry, or who was also a gay poet. But when Allen Ginsberg writes about erotic love, it's a much cruder language that he uses, than Manuel does. Manuel is a much more artful poet in that sense, and delicate poet. Not that I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but they're a different kind of diction, a choice of words, expressions.
Well, here's a question for you. My friend. Do you feel that a poem tells you what it wants to be? Does a poem tell you what it wants to be? Or do you tell it?
Does a poem tell you what it wants to be? For me, a poem is an invitation to dream, an invitation to explore, and it doesn't tell you directly what it wants to be. It's for you to find out and to make it what you want it to be. The poem is ultimately an invitation to explore something in a dilemma in your own mind as a reader, to answer a question that you might have in your mind. But the poem only belongs to you, the reader. You are the ultimate eater of the poem, And what happens inside when you eat that poem, inside of your body, inside of the body of your mind, is yours. And so there is no right or wrong. That's the first fallacy about reading poems, that there is a right answer and there's a wrong answer. There are only answers upon answers within answers within answers. It's a labyrinth. The poem is a labyrinth. And you, the reader, are invited to find a way out of the labyrinth, out of the maze. And the poem offers you some clues and images to interpret. And if you interpret them and you feel good about your interpretation, maybe those interpretations are windows through which you can climb out of the poem into the world and feel richer for having read that poem, emboldened for having read that poem, somehow sanctified for having read that poem, So the images of the poem are openings on evolution and completion, but they are not telling you where to go. They're telling you, here, look at me, interpret me, and you will find truth, your truth.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is not written directly into the poem. You have to gaze, like you gaze at the Mona Lisa, and you see those eyes following you wherever you are, looking at her.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So the poem looks back at you. The poem looks back at you, but you can't find. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not. There's not some kind of concrete answer in the poem, but it's a wonderful art because it engages you, just like painting engages you, just like music engages you. It transports you. You need it, I think, to live fully in this world. I mean, if you didn't have poems, or you didn't have music, or you didn't have painting, for example, just dance. I mean, all the arts are essential invitations to thinking, to feeling, and to catharsis too, because we all live with challenges in our lives, and art has a way of enabling us to find release, and overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just a distraction for a couple of hours that you spend reading or writing a poem. But I think it's something else. It's a way of living. It's a way of living that is very positive because it just keeps picking you up, no matter how challenging the day is, no matter how many difficulties you have to face. And everybody has to face mortality and passing and chaos sometimes. But the poem is a staff you could rely on, and it helps you stand up and walk forward. That's my feeling about it.
Very nice. As I shared, Indran, when I listen to you talk and share your thoughts and philosophies, poetry, and life, as I said, I always learn something new.
And it's very kind of you to say. I'm. There's nothing quite. It's a two-person conversation, right? If you ask the question, that brings out the reflection. So I'm just grateful to have that conversation, and I've had it with different books with you, and this one in particular is a conversation that I treasure because honestly, I don't know where I'd be without having started this adventure, more than 20 years ago when I started to translate these poems. And I've become a poet in various languages, and in Spanish I've written and published about 8 different books. But the first of those books I wrote, and Manuel was there guiding me, and so his poems available now in this translation is a very special thing for me. And I hope people who listen will look for the book because honestly, he's a very gifted poet. He was also very close to Octavio Paz, and people respected his work when he was writing. But time is cruel, and when you pass, and others move on, and so it's a nice thing to bring this poetry back into the conversation, the world conversation. I hope the book travels far. It just came to Mexico. I went to Mexico literally last week, and so the book, I carried the book to Manuel's sister Isabel, and also copies for his mother and a brother were there, and others who I met in Mexico with the poetry festival I attended. Are now aware of Manuel's work, so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that poems travel across borders. Yeah.
Yes. This article by Adolfo Castellano,
yes,
in memoriam. So I think about your work as well, that people really, as you just said, they cared about this man, what he stood for, what he believed in, and that is so powerful.
I should say.
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking that expression, give me my flowers while I live, and how sometimes we don't often get an opportunity to do that just due to the nature of life,
Yeah. And give me my flowers while I live. Yeah. Yes. Origami, yes.
Origami.
Give me my origami while I live.
Give me my origami while I live. Please share some more of your work, my friend.
All right.
Please share some more of your work.
I will say that, Manuel was, was the president of the Pen Club of Mexico in the last months of his life. And, he was hard at work writing letters to writers imprisoned unjustly in different countries and trying to raise awareness of their fate. And so that was a political work that he was doing as well. He was, Manuel was the grandson of Concha Mendez and Manolo Altolaguirre, who were both poets of the generation of 27 in Spain. They were both involved in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, and they became exiles from Spain after that war, with Franco and fascism taking over the country. And they went into Cuba, and then they came to Mexico. And then Manuel's mother, was born in Mexico, or I can't remember if she was born in Mexico, came to Mexico as a baby, and then Manuel was born. And so he carries a tradition in his blood of going back to those four Spanish poets of the Spanish Civil War. And that was the right war. Everyone wanted to engage to fight the fascism, and so many tragedies of that war, including the murder of Federico Garcia Lorca. So you read poets, you read also history in a sense.
Yes.
I'll read a couple more poems, then.
Yes.
I would love to do that. Let me think which ones. Here's one again from Manuel's travels in the Arabian countries. In this case, in Tangier, in Morocco. En un jardín de Tangier. A medianoche, cuando la bóveda estaba cuajada de estrellas y los cometas uno tras otro caían sobre el mar, entraste en el jardín secreto para hallar en el otro cielo. 100 tortugas llevaban sobre el caparazón una veladora encendida. Al caminar formaban constelaciones imprevistas, titilantes y luminosas rimas, otra escritura por el azar creada. Party in a Tangier's garden. At midnight, when the firmament was filled with stars, and comets one after another were falling over the sea, you entered the secret garden to find within it another sky. 100 tortoises were carrying lit candles on their shells. Walking, they formed unforeseen constellations string in luminous rhymes. Another writing created by chance. Viento. Bate el viento los cristales, las murallas, los tejados. En desvarío se filtra por rendijas y escaleras. Es percusión de timbales en la torre y en el foso. Aliento grave de tubas en el sendero que baja al río. Silbido agudo en todas las chimeneas. Movimiento encadenado en las copas de los árboles. Rápida fuga de nubes en el cielo azul intenso. Pausa, eco, silencio. En el castillo no hay nadie. El viento sopla por todas partes incesantemente. Algo en mí también se agita. Tal vez seas tú que llegas de repente muy lejos. Wind. The wind beats the windows, the walls, the roofs. Delirious, it filters through cracks and stairways. It is the percussion of timpani in the tower and in the moat. The heavy breath of tubers on the path that drops to the river. Sharp whistling in all the chimneys. Linked movement in the treetops. Rapid flight of clouds in the intense blue sky. A pause, an echo, silence. There is no one in the castle. The wind is blowing incessantly everywhere. Something in me also stirs. Perhaps it's you who arrive suddenly from far away. Perhaps I'll read one more.
Yes, please.
Otra vez, Jack. Again, Jack. In a hotel bar, after many years of knowing nothing of that friend, his name came up in conversation. And when you asked about him, the expression in the eyes of the stranger with whom you were talking made you realize that he had died. Then you were left to your thoughts, silent, sad, I don't know how long, remembering, while people continued to chat, as naked bodies striped like a tiger's by the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds. His thirsty, intense blue eyes that drank water from the spring of your eyes, his smooth, sculptured muscles, which upon the desiring and desired touch of your hands became fire, the synesthesia of the senses, as you forgot yourself and were forgotten in what other time, in that bedroom, where every afternoon desire created so much passion that it steamed the windows. So I trust that Manuel has steamed your windows. To all who listen to these words.
Does creating poetry, my friend, make you feel pain? Why not, if not?
You know, it rather than creates pain, it overcomes pain. You know, the pain is there, and I find a way to write from that pain, or in writing from that pain, I find consolation, a kind of release of that pain. The pain is a vise around your neck, and the way to get out of it is by sort of, rather than trying to pull it off your neck, squeeze it out with it in lines, you know, ooze it out. Somehow it's like, I'll tell you though, it's not always going to be possible in one language. I was in quite a lot of emotional pain in English in Mexico City a long time ago. And I couldn't write in English because the words would have come out as a scream, I think. But I was able to write in Spanish. There was a kind of a filter that took place, a distancing, trying to write in the other language, in this case in Spanish, that enabled me to write about, from those emotions, those painful emotions, not necessarily writing about them, but from them, stories in another language, in Spanish. So if you have a second language, try that technique. If you can't write in one, write this in the other. But I don't think really that poetry has ever caused me pain. There have been moments when I've been so sad and overcome by some difficult feeling that I wondered whether I could even write. But then eventually God comes to the rescue, or the muse comes to the rescue. I remember when the tsunami hit the Asian coastlines and in Sri Lanka, you know, about 35,000 people were washed away on Boxing Day, 2004, December 26th. And at the time, my elder brother, was in the island visiting and his family, and I was here in this house in Rockville. And my father had just passed away earlier, the previous year. And we were gathered at home at the first Christmas that I could remember without my father. Then this news comes in from the radio. We were listening to the radio, of all things, about this enormous wave, and this thousands of people disappeared from the coastline of Sri Lanka, and the coastline itself having been changed. Now, even more people away in Indonesia, and many countries were affected by this terrible tsunami. And I couldn't believe it. Here was an island that had been racked with civil war, uncivil war, I call it in one of my books. And now the tsunami on top, ecological disaster on top of political disaster. And I couldn't, and I just couldn't get my head around it. My heart was heavy, and for about 3 days, I wondered, can you write about this? Can I write about this? Someone, was it Adorno who said, about writing after the Holocaust? How can you write after the Holocaust? Well, 3 days, 4 days go by. My younger brother David happens to write a poem about this. And that got me going. Naturally, sibling rivalry always is helpful. But beyond that, I was able to write about this tragedy, this enormous tragedy, and I kept writing, and I wrote. Ended up thinking I could write 100 poems about different aspects of the tsunami. I ended up writing 56 poems, and I divided it into 4 sections, and the book is called The Splintered Face Tsunami Poems, and it's a book I'm very, very proud of. And I, raised some money from the book to donate to victims, and it was so even in the deepest tragedy, 9/11 happens. 2 weeks later, I managed to write a poem about that. So whatever the impetus, even in the deepest loss, my father dying, and I write. So, you have to accept that poetry is your savior. So why not take it along with you wherever you need.
Here's a question for you, my friend. Something I've always wanted to know. You're the only translator that I know. How? Tell me about translation. How did that come about? I've always wanted to ask you that.
Well, there's an old line about translation that it's a kind of traitor. You're a traitor to the original language, and your poetry can't be translated. That's the first thing you have to get rid of, Poetry can be translated. It needs to be translated. Not everybody speaks all the languages, and, the translator's role is very, very helpful to bringing the poetry, let's say, of one language into the poetry of another. But the translation is not just taking it from one language and putting it into the other. It's rewriting the poem in the new language. It's feeling the poem. Even though you may not have written the original poem, you try, like an actor, like a method actor or something, you try to find in yourself the emotions that drove, that informed the writer of the original poem, And when I was lucky with Manuel, because when I was translating the poems, I could ask him, well, does this have I captured the sensations that you wanted to express and I could ask him and get his opinion. That was helpful. And you don't always have that opportunity. You're translating a poet who might have died or somebody who lives far away and you don't have it. But translation, even Neruda translated, Borges translated Whitman, Leaves of Grass into Spanish. I mean, we learn from translation about how different voices are and how they speak, and it's an incredible nutritious thing to translate, because the other voice, for example, if I'm like Borges, when he translates Whitman into Leaves of Grass into Spanish, inevitably the voices of Whitman, the rhythms of Whitman, the images of Whitman become part of Borges too, and out in Borges, disguised in some other way, but you can't deny it's a growth. It's a hybrid plant that grows, and it's sturdier because it's a hybrid. It's stronger because it's a hybrid. Because you have opened yourself up to the influence of the other. Yeah. Go ahead.
Here we go. Now, my questions are not designed to stump you, because there's no way I could.
No, it's okay.
Even if I wanted to, there's no way I could. No. But as you can tell, I tried to research for this particular podcast because I knew I'd be interviewing. Here's the question that I found. Here's the question. It says, what do you think of poetry sandwiched between the original and the translation?
Now that's a question that stops me. What do you think?
That was just you.
No matter how much you deny it.
Sandwich between the original and translation? Yes.
Poetry sandwiched between the original and the translation. What do you think of it? Yes. Well, a sandwich actually contains the material inside of it, right? So the poetry is the bread. I don't think of poetry as sandwich between the original and the translation.
Okay.
I think poetry is in the original and it's in the translation. There is you just have to be willing to accept that your beautiful poem in whatever language it's written in can live another life, be renewed and refreshed and live quite happily in another language. And if you just accept that, then, I've got a book here by Emily Dickinson, and it's in bilingual. It's in French and English. So I'm enjoying reading Emily Dickinson translated into French. Why? Because I learn French words from it. I hear a different kind of music, or I hear Emily Dickinson's music transposed into the French language's music. I don't know. I think you don't lose something in translation. You gain something in translation. So the usual idea is it's lost in translation, There's a book by Eva Hoffman called Lost in Translation, which was a very important book for me for a while. But Lost in Translation, she was talking about the migrant, who moves from one country to another and what is lost in that movement. I think of it rather as what is gained, and inevitably loss is part of life. You can't, cells are lost every day and so on. I mean, you might lose a handkerchief. You can't go on keeping everything. You might lose a girlfriend. You might lose. Well, I was been to have lost some as well. So it's a sad thing when you recognize it. But it's wisdom when you recognize it and make a poem from it. Okay, that's what I think. That's what I think. Making poems is a wise restoration to the planet of the love that is gone. Okay, and you make it again, you renew it by writing the poem. So write poems and love again. Then you'll be refreshed enough and strong enough to go out and love again. So, because you can't avoid it. You can't avoid it. You can't live in a cell. You have to. You're part of society.
Here's a proverb in front of me. It says, "Just when the caterpillar thought the world was over, it became a butterfly." So, what you're saying? That sounds like you're going to be one of your philosophies.
No, that's good.
With you, the glass is always full. Always full. Never half full.
Well, it's full.
You can always do a positive reframe.
I appreciate that. It's full tonight. I'm in a good place. I'm feeling good. Mm-hmm. This is a lovely conversation. I can't say that it'll always be full, but I think as long as you keep enough water in the bottom of the glass, you can you never leave it, never let it run empty. Never let it run empty. That's all.
Well, what I'd like you to do is to share one last set of poems for us. One last one, please.
Okay. Let me go to again from the first part of the book, The River and the Stone. I'll read. Let me see. I'll read the first one, In the Steam Bath. With a thick stare, nose and mouth, and chiseled stone, marble statues, erected on pedestals of indifference, submerged in an impalpable dream, an aquarium of wandering, nervous fish, the image of the other. And in the steam on the mirror, he finds his own image, perplexed, absorbed, diffused. And then let me read also this somewhat longer poem, which I translated just at the very end of, just before the book went to press, which I hadn't translated. So Manuel never saw this particular translation. It's called, the original poem is La Piedra en el Fondo, The Stone in the Depths. And I'll read that and then you can see The Stone in the Depths. As my father's breathing fades away slowly, probes, needles, oxygen mask, between systole and diastole, on the stage of memory, one after the other, lived transparencies. The trip to school at 8 a.m. with its riddles about the Yellow River, the gardens of Mesopotamia, the Chinese wall and Newton's apple, and later at recess in the cool shade of tall ash trees, speaking with other children, the image of my father transformed into the hero of an adventure tale. And on the way home, the family reunited. My father recounts the 1,001 inventions of his laboratory, essences of rose, musk, and lavender, and the adventures of his child mother with trains of the revolution from Campeche to Mexico, cockfights her father loved so much, walks through mountains and along riverbanks, the forgotten image of his grandfather who painted fans in Valencia, his brief childhood in an immense garden, stories of immigrants from almost a century ago who left behind Gothic tower, olive grove, and cattle, and who never returned. At the end of the day, I muse about how my parents get ready to go to a party, and after the goodnight kiss, engrossed in the movie on black and white television, I imagine that this is life, and that my parents dance on a moonlit terrace to a waltz by Augustine Lara, and my father is the screen's leading man, the pirate of a naval battle, Tarzan in the Amazon jungle, and that someday I too will be an adult and smell violets on the neck of a girl and embody my fate as it was explained to me, while my father's breath fades away slowly. His pulse slower and slower. Between systole and diastole, time dilates, like concentric circles formed when a stone is thrown into the mirror of water. Each instant is an hour, and every hour a life. Brief time that passes, those sun-filled days in the country, rusty walls of the house, stable, corral, reservoir of the trough with its clouds reflected in transit, where one day my father taught me to measure the depths of the waters by the time it takes for the thrown stone to reach the bottom, and the woman who shells ears of corn as if shelling seeds of time. In what waters do we fall when we leave if there is no time? What is the depth of the sky? Where do the lived hours germinate? And already collected at dusk in a dimly lit room amid sonorous vapors of burning plates on white sheets, my father told me that in the next room his father had died. First image of finite time, falling stone, immense measure that we do not know, the sharp profile of his face, white sheet that shrouded his father, secret glance of the two ironers, hand and watch that take the pulse. My father sits up and asks, "What time is it?" And without listening, he says, "Tomorrow." At the same time, his body, shivering with cold, begins to give birth to another body, invisible butterfly with white wings, waiting for the exact time to let herself go in marriage with nothingness. While my father's breath is extinguished, anguish is reborn, a sharp-edged stone in the throat, those meals in my younger years where you could only hear scraping of cutlery and porcelain, elusive glances that hid the blush that produces the passion of flesh, and my secret games in the bedroom while the hurtful light coming through the window illuminated the clouds of the jug, empty plates and crumbs, for in my lascivious daydreams my singular desire had been revealed. No longer would I be the image of the hero dancing with a girl on the screen, nor the maker of factories, nor the discreet man society applauds, nor prey to virginities on the prowl, nor father who perpetuates and later the disputes. Freedom does not make men happy, says my mother. It makes them only men. My father is silent, fragile armor, his indifference. My father lives in the ideogram of his world, builds other dreams without thinking of the finiteness of time, in the stone and its fall, in the darkened alcove, tomorrow, tomorrow, always tomorrow, and the house grows while my mother grows grey hair, and my sister discovers her budding breasts in the mirror, and my grandmother becomes a child again, tomorrow, tomorrow, always tomorrow, while my father's breathing fades away slowly. I want to tell him that all I ever wanted was to live the truth of my true love. But he no longer hears anything, no longer says anything. Silence has taken over his body, my mother's body, the circle formed around his bed, the darkened room, the clear mirror of water where the stone continues to fall in the fragile gravity of the instant, while my father's breathing dies away. The transparency of the window reminds me that outside the world exists. I contemplate the illuminated city, the cars that circulate, the teenager who meets his beloved on the corner, the cyclist passing by, the athlete running in the meadow. Absorbed in the fragility of time, I contemplate the world, the window again, the family reunited. And I think that my father no longer speaks, no longer sees, no longer hears, that his dead senses begin to perceive the theatre of the world through us, that the only memory of his life were the fragments of our memory, immersed puzzle from which pieces are missing. What will he think of as he abandons himself in my mother's skin, the newsreels of the Second War, of the First Communion and the commandments, of tumors that spread through the body? My father, between stammering, says he has a stone in his neck, that his stone will not fall, that he will not fall with it, that he will fall with it. Where to? Where? As my father's breath goes out, it seems that he will begin to forget everything. Chemotherapies and executioners, waiting rooms and operating rooms, portrait of his grandmother and the young legs of the girls, the stone of Oaxaca and the song of the canary, the red rattle and the first cry. Or perhaps in his oblivion, the last dream the time devours. He travels along a road to look for his father, but the road is already another road, and the house another house. His life now fits in an instant. All parts are reconciled. A single sun burns in his conscience, icy fire that consumes the world. In the mirror of water, the last wave is drawn. The stone in its fall reached the bottom. Thank you so much, Michael. That was another of his longer poems.
Oh, beautiful. You know, I was thinking, an incredible man translating the work of another incredible man.
Thank you.
Well,
so
one
glad,
last question
so glad
about
to have
Manuel.
this chance. So glad.
What was his disposition? Was he a happy man, a melancholy man? What was his disposition?
He was a very generous. He was a very generous man. Very generous. He would always come in his car and he would pick me up and take me to places that he was very proud of the Mexico and he wanted me to see it, the city that he knew, the Mexico City that he knew, and he showed me this beautiful city and this beautiful culture. He talked to me. I remember walking with him on Francisco Sosa, where he lived, and he pointed out the chapel that you find on that street where La Malinche used to go and pray. La Malinche was the woman who was the consort of Cortez, and when Cortez and the Spanish took over the country, and very interesting to hear that history, to see that history, and to actually see the chapel where La Malinche used to pray after. So, and Manuel was my teacher in that sense, and my guide. But at the same time, he was a very generous man. He used to have wonderful parties, and we also invited him home, and I remember we had a party where we had asked everyone to wear hats, and so everybody Manuel came in a glorious feathered hat for the occasion. So we had parties, we had lots of fun. He was melancholic. He was. I think poets tend to be melancholic. We have to find a way to deal with that melancholy. Different poets have different methods. In my case, it's writing poetry.
Yes.
And writing poetry dispels the melancholy. And in the case of Manuel, I think that helps, and that helped, and also his work with pen and so on. But Manuel had his moments of dark moments, but he pulled through, and he was in a good place when I last saw him, and he lives in these poems in very much.
Yes, he does.
Again,
I could feel his presence just listening to you. You know.
Yeah.
So to me, it's a job well done, my friend. Job well done.
Thank you very much.
Job well done. Indran, as we close, where does this particular book fit into your career as a writer?
What does this particular interview say the last part? I couldn't hear.
Where does this book fit into your career as a writer? What's next for you? Where do you go? Yes.
Yeah, where do I go next? Yeah. Well, I think further into translation, I'm working on a few different translation projects of different poets into bringing them into English, and so I've taken on a bit too much, more than I can chew, but I'm trying to chew different. So I'm working on a book from a Swiss poet, bringing his French poems into English, and a Mexican poet, another Mexican poet, into English, and the Chilean poet poems into English. And so I've got these different projects that I've started, and then I think at the magazine that I edit with Sarah and Renee Garrity, it's called the Beltway Poetry Quarterly. We make a point of publishing translations as well as reviews, and so we like to publish the original language with the translated language. So sometimes I translate for the magazine too, individual poems. So translation is a big part of where I'm going. I'm also going to go into. I've got a lot of poems that I need to organize that I in English, and I'm trying to keep up in French and Spanish especially, and in English. So Creole, I have a book that's scheduled to come out from Mad Hat Press. But I'm not quite sure what the timeline will be for it. But it's poems I wrote in Creole and then translated myself into English. So that's a project that's in the future. And I'm hoping a book in Spanish or in Portuguese soon.
Indran. When will you sleep? When will I sleep? When will you sleep?
I'm going to sleep more often because without sleep, all of this will come crashing to a halt. So I'm going to sleep more often and every day. All right?
Well,
not to worry.
I'm going to ask you this one last question, then we can go. We can both leave. This is one that I've always wanted to know. It says, what do you think a literary journal's role and task should be in a changing world, in this changing world? In five words or less.
Well, the world is
question
always,
of the night.
Your questions are something else. They're wonderful. The world is always changing. They are, Michael. They really are. I mean, you don't have that doctor before your name for nothing, But no. But that's
well,
a good
I know
doctor.
I had to be on my A game with you. All right,
well, it's
sorry.
a doctor of literature. It's a doctor of literature, No, seriously. I do think that the world is changing. We are changing. The literary magazine, many magazines have become digital magazines, right?
Yes.
So change is the constant, right? But literary magazines have a role to play in various ways. One, editors of the magazines are a kind of first stop to honing the art. Poets write, they send the poems in, they get accepted or they get rejected. Hopefully they'll get some feedback and they'll be able to get a sense of, that when the poem is accepted, it's somehow certified, in the society. The editors have a role to a kind of vetting process, right? And they help the poem have a certain kind of legitimacy in the society, right? So it's edited, it's accepted for the magazine, it's published. And then also, no poet is an island. You know what I mean? You need the editor. You need the editor to not just to accept or reject your poem, but also sometimes to edit your poem or to comment on your poem or to give you a perspective on your poem or poems that you may not have yourself. And I think that's an important role for the literary magazine. And for example, when we do an issue of Beltway Poetry Quarterly, often we have a theme, and so we can, encourage poets to go through their work and edit their work to find the theme or the poem that works with the theme of the issue. But I think the literary magazine is. I know it's hard because I know from doing Beltway, sometimes we are delayed. We're delayed with the current issue. It's hard to juggle everything that's going on in one's life and meet deadlines. But I think the world is a richer place for the literary magazine. I'll tell you a story about my great uncle Thambi Muthu. My father too was a poet, Amirthanayagam, and through my dad I met my great uncle in London. My great uncle used to come over from Neil every week to our home in London when I was a kid. He was the editor. He's a legend. I mean, he edited Poetry London. He founded the magazine, and then he edited it during the war, during the Blitz. And there was no paper during that war, but he somehow found the paper, and he printed the magazine every month, I think it was. And, he published Dylan Thomas there, the young Dylan Thomas, he put Henry Moore illustrations on the covers of the original magazine. So he brought artists and poets together in the time of war and got this magazine out. And I think that's a great contribution to keeping culture alive during times of great stress. And here we are at the moment with wars going on today, in Ukraine and the invasion in other places. And so wherever poetry can be kept going in such times, I think it just reminds you how important it is. So when the music dies, the culture dies. When the words are not written or not published or not shared, it's a kind of a death. So we have to keep the words going, and the magazine has its role. It could be a digital magazine now. It could be sometimes there are problems, and we are human beings. We have limited taste sometimes. Some editors, should not be editors. Some magazines, I don't know why they don't open up their doors to different voices. And, we have our tastes and our critiques, and, every human being, every poet has his or her favorite magazines and so on. But I think the concept of the magazine, the literary magazine, is a useful one for the preservation and replenishment of our culture, so our literary culture. So all power to them, and support them when you can, and whichever way you can.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Indran, thank you again for being my guest. Whenever you publish a book, please come back.
Thank you so much, Michael. You've given me. I'm so grateful to you, and you've given me a lot of time. I hope that our listeners will enjoy this and have enjoyed this, and I'm really grateful. Manuel Ulacia is a great poet, and please look for his book. It's published by Diálogos Books. It's easily available through the Diálogos Books website, or if you're even interested in signed copies, you can contact me, indranmx@gmail.com, indranmx@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to get copies out to you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And everyone,
thank you,
as I share it through every week, let poetry ring somewhere throughout the land. Good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Take care,
you.
Indran.
Thank you.
All right, my
Thank
friend.
you so much, Michael. All the best. Yes. Love and poetry.
Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio, is available on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. You can also check out the website at qlpor.com.